Hi, my name is Catherine Nudera, and this is my presentation on Mini-Ethnographic studies. All right, so the person that I interviewed for this, his name was Beckett Carls. He is an 8-year-old boy. He's a third grader at Elmwood Elementary School, which is an elementary school in the district I teach in, but not the school that I teach in. And his country of origin is Puerto Rico. So technically a part of the United States. However, they speak a different language there. They speak Spanish. As well as English, but the main language is Spanish. And his length of stay in the U.S. So he moved here in the middle of his kindergarten year, right around winter break, which at this point would be 3.5 years ago. He's just finishing third grade at the time of my observation and interview with him. So a little bit about his parents then. Shannon Carls, his mom, Scott Carls, his dad. So Shannon is the one who's from Puerto Rico. I know the name sounds very Irish. Her dad is Irish. Her mom is Puerto Rican. So her native language is Spanish, and then she acquired English through her schooling in Puerto Rico. So prior to kindergarten, she only spoke Spanish, and as she went through her education, she learned English, and is now a fairly proficient speaker. Scott is the father. He is from America. He's a native English speaker, and through education, junior high, high school, college, he learned Spanish. And then when the two of them met, they ended up moving to and staying in Puerto Rico until 3.5 years ago when they moved back to the States. So a little bit of information that I learned about Beckett through my observations. So I observed him during a writing lesson where the students had written a narrative, a story about an experience that they had had. And the lesson that I observed was them peer editing with a partner. So they would read the story aloud to each other, and they would make suggestions for edits for grammar, for spelling, anything that they would think would improve upon the story. They had an editing checklist as well with them. So what I kind of observed throughout this was that he's become fairly proficient in English speaking skills since moving to the continental United States. I observed him talking with his partner, and this is also an observation I made when interviewing him. All of his answers were something you would almost consider to be a native speaker. So his speaking skills are fairly proficient. I found that he has improved in his reading, writing, and listening skills, but he's not considered to be grade level. I observed this, and then I also had a conversation with his teacher after the observation without the students in the classroom. So I would say mainly his reading and writing is the skills he's furthest away from grade level. His listening skills are fairly proficient, but there are times where he becomes a bit confused when larger words are used in the classroom, especially when directions are given. And his reading and writing skills, I observed that his writing skills in this observation, he was a lot lower grade level. He wasn't using as big of words. He was not using a lot of synonyms. For example, if he used the word little, you would see it 5 times in his writing. And I got the chance to walk around other students, and I would see, again, using that example of little, they would say little and mini and small, and just using multiple synonyms. They had that knowledge of the language to be able to do that, whereas Beckett did not. As far as his reading skills, I was able to observe this a little bit because during the peer editing process, they would read each other's stories. So Beckett was reading his partner's story. And at one point I asked him to read a bit to me. And while he was able to read his partner's story to me, or the portion I asked him to, he was not able to do it at the same level of his partner or others that I observed. He was a little bit slower. He stumbled over a few words. He was still able to do it, but not at the same level of his peers. And then I also observed that interviewing his mother, that he highly preferred speaking Spanish while he was living in Puerto Rico, but since moving to the continental states, he prefers speaking the language of his friends, English. So I kind of am taking this as he was surrounded more by his Spanish-speaking peers. His grandmother did a lot of the child care, and although she did speak a little bit of English, she would speak Spanish with him. So it was what he was comfortable with. Both of his parents used both languages with him. And then he had half of a year of kindergarten in a classroom where most of the students spoke Spanish and were learning English, maybe not for the first time, but in the first time in a school setting. So he was surrounded by Spanish speakers. He preferred Spanish. Moving to America, the continental United States, there's not many people in his class that speak anything but English that he would be able to understand. So he prefers it because he's able to communicate, make friends, so a lot more. And that was something I was able to observe versus obviously the Puerto Rican portion of that observation comes from his parents. So then some of the theories and issues that I took from our class readings came from the Module 6 readings. Those definitely were more focused on Latino students. And since Beckett is from a Spanish-speaking country, a Latino student, I focused on those. The first one I looked at was The World Outside and Inside Schools, Language and Immigrant Children. This was an article from our Module 6. And one of the examples that I found to be similar to Beckett's experience is one of Eliza. And she is a junior high student, so somebody who's transitioning from one classroom to the next for each subject. So that, in that sense, is a little different than Beckett. But the way I found it to be similar is the transition to mainstream was deemed her level of proficiency. So therefore she was placed into classes, for example, math, with mainstream students or native English speaking students. And the issue with this was that she was taught at the ability levels of the mainstream peers. Her teacher did not provide any additional support because she was an EL student. She taught as if her whole class was native English speakers. And this kind of seems to be an issue that is also similar in Beckett's situation. Yes, there are occasions where Beckett receives a bit of additional support from an EL teacher who pushes in or pulls out, but this is very limited, especially with his English proficiency at this point. So he does not receive a lot of support for his English learning. And it's kind of, he's taught like the rest of his peers. So then kind of a solution that I was able to find was in Language, Culture, and Teaching, Critical Perspectives for a New Century. This is one of our textbooks. This was chapter 9 from Module 6 from Nieto. And a couple of pieces of advice that it gave teachers who are in a situation like Beckett's teacher is, or like Eliza's teachers were, is that they should be learning for their students. So learning about language L1 acquisition and L2 acquisition. So going in and actually learning, how does a student acquire a new language, even if they are at a high proficiency level, becoming educated on how they can teach that specific student in the classroom. And then the other option for that was given in this chapter was teachers asking for support from their EL staff. So somebody who is educated in the things that they would also potentially do research in, asking them because they are the expert for help. And this one can be a little bit more tailored to each student because they have the ability to share. This student, for example, using Beckett, he spoke English his whole life, but was more focused on Spanish when he was in Puerto Rico, and now he's in Illinois and he's speaking more English. What can I do for a student like this to support him? So these are definitely some suggestions that I would have for all teachers. It's definitely something that is more beneficial if you have that EL staff member, because like I said, you can modify it and ask for support help from a specific student standpoint. This is definitely something that is considered best practice at this point in the education world. It's best practice to provide support for students in all tiers. If the student is struggling in a subject, we create small groups for them, reteach groups for them. If a student has ADHD, we accommodate for them. We allow them, for example, to have a different type of chair or a fidget. There's all these different accommodations that we do for our students, and their Yale students should receive the same type of support and accommodations. Their accommodation may not be physical, but they are doing something that's different than the rest of their peers. They're learning the content as well as learning and acquiring the language. So I think those would be great ideas to implement into Beckett's class as he moves on to fourth grade, and just something for all teachers to consider. As I mentioned, I received my information from Nieto's Language, Culture, and Teaching, Critical Perspectives for a New Century, and that was from Chapter 9 that I was mentioning on the previous slide. And then The World Outside and Inside Schools, Language and Immigrant Children. This was an